turn with me to Isaiah 11. We are in a series called Christmas Throwback, and I know we had several out last week sick. We have several out this week sick. So each week I'm going to give you a little recap as to what we're doing here, because for one, it's pretty unfamiliar to a lot of us. But for people who aren't here, when they come in, they might think they've walked into a Catholic church. So we're going to explain some of what we're doing. Over the years, the culture has eroded the meaning of Christmas. Christmas seems to be more now about Santa Claus or cheesy Christmas movies or togetherness or all of these things than it seems to be about the birth of Christ. And there's nothing wrong with any of those things. I've watched many a Hallmark movie in my life, just zero this year, praise the Lord. He delivered me from that. But Christmas ought to have its true meaning and its true perspective, its true focus ought to be on the birth of Christ. And so the early church and most liturgical churches today celebrated this event called Advent. It's the Advent season. And over the years, a lot of evangelicals and a lot of non-liturgical churches have dropped that concept, and we have even went so far as to call it empty ritual. But I think that you're seeing a resurgence in this, not just here in this church, but you're seeing it across the land. You're seeing that this season is a way to combat some of the commercialism of Christmas and to restore the focus back to Jesus Christ. So this season, we as a church are celebrating Advent, and I hope that you're doing this in your homes as well. This has deep meaning, it has deep ritual, and it's as good an answer as there is out there to the secularization of Christmas. So let me just recap from last week. What is Advent? The term Advent literally means an arrival. When we celebrate it, we celebrate the arrival of Jesus Christ coming as the baby in the manger. But that's not the only arrival we celebrate. We look forward to the second Advent. We look forward to when He returns again. When He comes back, we celebrate God coming down as a baby in a manger, but we also celebrate Christ returning as a conquering king and a ruler who will bring and restore peace to the earth. So each week we light a candle. And that's what this wreath is up here for. You see that the one candle is lit from last week. The whole wreath is symbolic. It's an evergreen that symbolizes life in the midst of death. If you think of wintertime, just look out the window. The only trees that are going right now are evergreens. Everything else appears dead, but you have these evergreens full of life, and unless you cut them down like the one in my yard. It's in a circle that reminds us of God's unending love. It reminds us that God infinitely loves us to infinity. And then there are the 5 candles. 4 candles are purple. 1 candle is pink. Different traditions have different meanings for those. But what we're doing here is that the candles represent faith, hope, and peace, and the pink candle represents joy. And so next week we'll light the joy candle, the pink one, but this week we're looking at faith. Last week we looked at hope, and that's the candle that has already been lit. And so today at the end of the service we will light the faith candle. So Isaiah chapter 11. As we read in Isaiah 11, you got to have a little bit of perspective as to what's going on here, or you're just going to be lost. Isaiah is writing 700 years before Jesus Christ was born in a manger. As he's writing, the nation's under attack. You have the Assyrians had come in and they'd conquered Israel. Israel had turned its back on God. You had God using these people from the outside who didn't believe in him to conquer his people who didn't believe in him. And now God says, I'm going to bring judgment on Assyria as well. So Assyria conquers the Israelites, but now God's going to bring that judgment onto Assyria. He's going to turn it around on them. And that's Isaiah 10. That's the chapter right before this. And most of you know, they didn't write the little numbers originally in the book. And so those numbers were added later. You've got to look at them all together. So as you look at chapter 10, it goes with chapter 11. And we see Assyria was cruel to the Israelites. They were prideful. And God says, I'm going to bring judgment. And that Isaiah 10 is all about the judgment that God is going to bring on Assyria. To really get the context for our passage today, we need to go back into chapter 10 and look at the last two verses, and that's Isaiah 10:33. So look back or flip the page and see Isaiah 10:33. And I'm going to read today this passage from the New Living Translation because it puts it a little bit clearer. It says, look, the Lord of heaven's armies will chop down the mighty tree of Assyria with great power. He will cut down the proud. The lofty tree will be brought down. He will cut down the forest trees with an axe. Lebanon will fall to the mighty one. So at the end of chapter 10, Isaiah is painting this picture for us. And it's a picture of a whole forest of trees. I'm thankful that we still have a forest of trees right over here that you can probably picture in your mind. 10 years from now, that'll probably be cleared out and there'll be a store or something there. But right now, there's a forest of trees right there. You can picture that in your mind. As you come in, I've seen deer running across there. It's very peaceful, unless you're driving right through there and then you don't want them there because you might hit them. But think about a forest, that forest or some forest in your mind. Now cut all the trees out. Cut them all down. And what are you left with? You're left with a bunch of ugly stumps. They're dead. They're dying. And when you chop something down with an axe, which is what God said he was going to do, you can't remove the stump. You can't axe the ground. And so there are all these stumps that are there. And it's just an ugly, ugly picture that we get in our mind. We had this tree in our yard that fell down. It just fell over of its own accord. And the stump was there. And we sawed the tree up, but the stump was still there. And I mowed around the thing forever and ever. You couldn't mow over it because it'd mess the mower up. You had to mow around it. And then one day I got a little bit too close to it. And I realized that it wasn't really wood anymore. It was just spongy. And I just used the mower and pushed everything out. It was because it was dead, rotting, deteriorated. And so eventually it just dissolved into nothing pretty much. The stump served no purpose. It was dead, it was decaying, and it just disintegrated into these little wood chips that I mowed over and just spread out into the yard. And I'm thankful my grandpa sharpens the blade, and I didn't have to after we were done. So that's the context that we're coming into our passage today. This forest of stumps, forest of dead, decaying, dying things. So chapter 11 begins with verse 1. There shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. And the Spirit of the Lord shall rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, the Spirit of counsel and might, the Spirit of knowledge and the fear of the Lord. And his delight shall be in the fear of the Lord. He shall not judge by what his eyes see, or decide disputes by what his ears hear. But with righteousness he shall judge the poor, and decide with equity for the meek of the earth. And he shall strike the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips he shall kill the wicked. Righteousness shall be the belt of his waist, and faithfulness the belt of his loins. Probably I could have just read verses 1 and 2, but once you get started reading that, it's hard to stop. I'd really like to read the rest of it, but I'm not preaching about that today. Maybe in a week or two. Not only does Isaiah say that the Assyrians are going to have this field full of dead stumps, but he says the Davidic line is also going to come down to a rotting stump. Remember, God promised that somebody from the kingdom of David would always have a place in the throne. That's what he's saying here. Isaiah talks about this stump of Jesse. Jesse was the father of King David. Isaiah is speaking here about this Davidic line of kings. Everybody who followed David. And Isaiah saw things are going to get really bad for this country. Things are going to get really bad for this line of royalty. David's line is going to come to such a decline that it's going to be essentially left for dead. He says that you're going to have a stump there. And that's exactly what happened. Eventually, all of the rulers from David's family were gone, and people continually came in and began conquering the Israelites. You had the Assyrians, you had the Babylonians, you had the Medes and the Persians, you had Rome. And it went on and on and on until 1948, whenever Israel was established as its own sovereign nation again. The image here is of this tree that has been so devastated that only a stump remains. That's what he's talking about with Israel. So everywhere you look in this picture now, there are stumps. Assyrian stumps, Israel stumps. There are stumps for the Assyrian army. There are stumps for the Israelite kings. That's the picture. Everything is dead. Everything is decaying. Everything is eroding. As you look out, you see no life. You just see everything broken, and it doesn't look like it can be fixed. I wonder if any of us have ever been in a situation like that. Everywhere we look, all around us, the whole situation seems bleak. The whole situation seems hopeless. Everywhere we look is death and decay and doom and despair. And the thing about a stump is, it looks dead for sure, but you never really know how dead it is until you get up and put a little pressure on it, and you see if it's how decaying and how dead it is. When that mower hit that stump, it just poof. I mean, it like just disappeared like it was magic. And so, have you ever been in a situation like that? A situation that is so despairing, that is so full of just doom and despair, that you don't see any life growing. Everywhere you look, there's nothing that, and you put your hands on it, you try to fix it, but whenever you put your hands on it and you try to fix it, everything just falls apart. You can't fix the situation. Only God can fix the situation. And we get into these situations like that where we think we can go in and bring back life. We can't do that. The picture Isaiah gives, it's this forest, but it's not a beautiful forest like we have next to us. It's a forest of death and a forest of decay. and a forest of doom and despair. But right in the middle of all of this decay and rot, new life begins to spring out. New life begins to spring forward. You have this stump that has a shoot that is beginning to spring out. He says it's just a little shoot, but it's this shoot that's coming from the dead line, and this shoot is going to grow into a branch, and this branch is going to bear fruit. And he gives us this new picture. In the midst of all of this doom and all this despair, you see a new shoot coming up. In the middle of all of the turmoil, in the middle of all of the devastation, God gives the Israelites a promise. And it's a huge promise. He's telling the people through the prophet Isaiah, I know things look bleak. I know things don't look good. Everywhere you look is doom, gloom, and agony. But I have a promise for you. I have not abandoned you. I will never leave you. I will never forsake you. Instead, I'm going to work to bring new life out of this old life. Out of this old dead and decaying life, I'm going to bring a new life. Where there is brokenness, God always brings hope. Where there is darkness, God always brings light. Where there was once a mighty tree full of life and a beautiful place for birds and squirrels and whatever other critters you have running around in there, these beautiful trees had been chopped into these dying and despairing stumps. But God says you're going to have this shoot come up. He didn't say when or how, did he? He just said it's going to happen. He gave a promise. He was saying, I am not done yet. I've barely begun. This statement was intended to spark some hope in these people that what appeared to be an absolutely hopeless situation was not hopeless because God was still in the situation. Three things I want you to take from this passage today. First thing is God's promises bring life to decaying situations. God's promises bring life to decaying situations. Look again at verse 1. He says a shoot will come from the stump of Jesse. You ever wonder why he says Jesse and he doesn't say David? Because we think of David, the line of David. We don't think of the line of Jesse. Well, David was a king. Jesse was a common man. Jesse was a shepherd from Bethlehem. And God wanted us to relate to Jesse and not David, because this shoot wasn't going to come as royalty in a palace. This shoot was going to come to Bethlehem. And this shoot was going to come and become a commoner. The only king in the Old Testament who is listed as the son of Jesse is David. So there's a little more to it than just what we said. All the rest of these kings that followed David were called the sons of David. But now he's referring back to Jesse. And by doing that, Isaiah is revealing from the family line the Messiah is going to come. He's saying it's going to come from Jesse, but he's saying that he is at least going to be as important as David. David did a lot of awesome things. David brought a lot of deliverance for the country. We know now in hindsight that this king is even greater than David ever was, because he was David's Lord. He says, the Lord said to my Lord. And so he explains all of this in the New Testament. Here's what I want you to know. How encouraged are you going to be if you're one of the people of Israel right now? You're looking around and there's doom, gloom, despair. All you see is stumps. And he says, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to send you a shoot. What do we say to that? Can't you give me an oak tree? A shoot? You're going to send me a shoot? What good is a shoot going to be to me? Can't you send me something better than that? God points to this little shoot and he says, that right there, that's my promise to you. And if I were these people, I'd be like, well, I'm not real encouraged right now. I'm really not feeling what you're selling here, God. Let's be honest, most of us are going to feel that way. When he says, this is your promise, this is what you have, it's a shoot. Think about a shoot. Somebody brings a weed whacker in, that thing's gone, isn't it? That's what I do to them when they grow out of these stumps that are in my yard. I weed whack them. Think about that. You don't get enough rain, that shoot's gone. You get too much rain, that shoot could be gone. You get a little bit of wind, that shoot could be gone. A shoot is very volatile. A shoot is very helpless. A shoot, you just don't know what's going to happen with it. What's he referring to? This shoot, this sprout. He's referring to a baby that was going to be born in a manger. Jesus is the shoot that Isaiah is talking about. That's why we celebrate Advent. It's because he came as this shoot. God chose to come to earth, and he came not as an oak tree, but he came in a vulnerable state, in a helpless state, as a baby in a manger. He was defenseless. Isaiah saw that while the Davidic line of kings would seem to be dead, life would remain within the stump. This shoot, this life that was barely detectable at first, it's going to emerge. And once that shoot went forth, what happens to shoots? They eventually grow into a mighty tree. There's a problem with that, though. You don't plant a tree today and have a nice shade to sit in next summer. Right? It takes time. It takes time. 700 years he's writing here before the birth of Jesus Christ. Think about that. And things got even worse before they got better. 300 years went by, and God went silent. God spoke through prophets. Isaiah is one of these prophets. But after 300 years, the prophets stopped. God stopped speaking to the prophets. There was a period of 400 years when you read through your Bible and you stop it, when you read Malachi, and before you get into Matthew, we just think that happened immediately, but there were 400 years of silence between those two pages. 400 years. Think about how silent God would be. Most of us can't picture 400 years. 1622. Can you picture that? America was not even in existence as a country at that time. 400 years ago. Can you think if God was silent all of those years? All hope was gone except for this one little nugget. A shoot will come up from the stump of Jesse. From his roots a branch will bear fruit. Second thing, this one's important. The passage of time does not negate the promises of God. The passage of time does not negate the promises of God. This week's theme is not hope. That was last week. It's faith. Well, what is faith? The writer of Hebrews defined it as the reality of what is hoped for, the proof of what is not seen. Paul tells us that faith comes from hearing, and hearing through the word of Christ. Again, the writer of Hebrews says, without faith it is impossible to please him, for whoever would draw near to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who diligently seek him. And again, Paul said we walk by faith, not by sight. For 400 years, the people did not see the presence of God. For 400 years, the people did not hear from God. You know they had their doubts. You know they wondered if God abandoned them. You know that they wondered if God had forgotten about them. And as more time went on, you know that they began to wonder if maybe this God that they'd worshipped was not just a figment of their imagination. But Christmas was proof that God never left them. God never forsook them. God hadn't forgotten them. And he definitely hadn't forgotten his promise. He hadn't left them. He hadn't forgotten them. He hadn't forgotten his promise. Well, what in the world took so long then? He was waiting on the perfect time. And sometimes in our lives, we look around and we say, God, what's taking you so long? He's waiting on the perfect time. We live in this fast food society. We want everything right now. If we go through McDonald's or Brahms or Wendy's, we are mad if it takes them 5 minutes to get our burger made. You can't even go home and get everything out to make a burger in 5 minutes. They're doing it in 5 minutes, and we're still upset by that. I read the other day this statistic that the average person gets mad if a web page doesn't load within 15 seconds. 15 seconds. We get upset about that. And we complain about how horrible our internet is. Do you remember the old days? If I wanted to research something, I had to walk to the library. When I got to the library, I had to go to the card catalog. You remember those? Pull it open, try to find the book that I was looking for. Then I had to do that Dewey Decimal thing and try to find it on a shelf. And if it had more than 2 numbers after the period, I was lost. I'm like, I don't know where these come from. And obviously the shelvers were too, because it probably wasn't me that was lost, it was them, because the books were never in the right place. You remember these days? Then you had to look at the table of contents or the index, and you had to find whatever you were looking for. Then you had to go and you had to read a whole chapter, because there was no is it Alt F or Control F that you can just find and match your keywords, right? You can't do that with a book. You had to do all of this stuff, and then when you were done, you still had to walk back to your house. Or drive if you were over the age of 16. Yet here we are. 15 seconds, we're mad because the page doesn't load. Listen, God is not a fast food God. God is a, come on in, sit down, can I take your order? Because I'm going to make it from scratch. It's going to take a while, and it's going to be something that's way better than what you ever expect. But it's going to take me a little bit to cook this up. I went to, I don't know if they still do it. It's been a while since I've been to Wendy's. But when I was at Wendy's, you know, it was all about, when I was working there, it was all about getting people in, getting them out real quick. Well, one day I went to Wendy's, and they said, your order's going to take a little bit because we're making everything fresh. Is that okay? And that was the way that they greeted me over as I pulled up to the drive-thru. And I'm like, this is weird. What's going on? You're making everything, don't you always make everything fresh? But I know their chicken sandwich, I may not work there. I shudder at the things we serve people at 1 o'clock in the morning that have been sitting there for 6 hours. They said, is it okay if it takes a little longer if we make everything fresh? And I said, absolutely. I'll wait as long as you want if you're going to make everything fresh. Because we tend to settle for less because we're so inclined to getting it fast that we end up settling for less than the best. And that's what we do in our lives so many times. We want God to respond right now, and we want God to respond the way that we want Him to respond, when really He's got something cooking back in the kitchen, and if we just wait for that, He's going to bring it out, and it's going to be way better than that hamburger that's been sitting on the grill for about 10 hours that ought to be put in the chili. You know, that's what they do with the burnt burgers, right? You're eating the burnt burgers when you eat Wendy's chili. At least you used to be. They at least boil them first. Everybody's like, I ain't eating chili from Wendy's anymore. 400 years. Think about that. It seemed like an eternity to them. It seems like an eternity to us. But here's the thing. It seems crazy to us from our mindset, but to God it doesn't seem that crazy because He exists outside of time. His time is different than ours. His word says that a day is like 1,000 years and 1,000 years is like a day. God exists outside of it. Do you want to know when Jesus was born? I'm not saying the day. Here's what I can tell you. He was born when the timing was right. Because that's what Paul tells us in Galatians 4:4. He says, but when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth His Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons. And because you are sons, God has sent the Spirit of His Son into our hearts, crying, Abba, Father. So you are no longer a slave, but a son, and if a son, then an heir through God. God sent Jesus to be born in the manger when the time was right. That's when He was born. God's never early. God's never late. He's always right on time. His timing is perfect. We tend to look at our watches when we pray to God, and we say, man, it's been 5 minutes. And He hasn't answered my prayer. What's going on? He's not your wife that you're texting who you expect an immediate response from. That's not the way it works. He's not your kid who you want to text and you better text me back quick if you want to keep that phone. That's not the way God is. God is perfect in His timing. And He's going to answer when the timing is perfect. The passage of time does not negate the promise of God. If He gives you a promise, you better stand on it. Whether it's been 5 minutes, been 10 minutes, whether it's been a year and a half or 2 years, you stand on that promise. It's not going to come to pass when you think it ought to come to pass. It's going to come to pass when the time is perfect. Sometimes God needs to teach us a little something in the midst of those trials that we want to be out of so fast. Sometimes God delays answers so that we can learn lessons while we're in the midst of these trials. Sometimes God needs to teach us not to rely so much on ourselves, and so we go through these financial struggles where we want the money to come in the middle of the month, but it doesn't come in until the day before the bill's due, because God's teaching us, don't rely on yourself, rely on Him. Maybe He needs to teach us some patience. Anybody? Maybe He's teaching us something in the midst of all of these things. we ordered pizza a while back. Heather always orders it. I never order it. But I love technology because she orders it and then she looks at her phone for like the next 30 minutes. Because she knows that the boys are going to ask, when's the pizza coming? And they have this app and it says, okay, we've received your order. First it says you placed your order. We've received your order. The pepperoni is going on the pizza. I don't know if it gets that detailed, but it says we're making the pizza. Then it says your order is being boxed up. Then it says the delivery driver is carrying out. He tripped over his shoelace. No, it doesn't. It's not that detailed, but it's pretty detailed, right? And she's able to look at all of these things and tell. Well, the other night it said it's out for delivery, and it didn't come. And we're like, what? Where's the pizza? You know, we live 5 minutes from Domino's. I could have walked up there and got it and came back. Where's the pizza? It said it was out for delivery, but it wasn't there yet. And so Heather's phone rang, and the guy said, where do you live? And then she said, down on the south end of town. And he said, I'm on the north end of town. That's where my GPS sent me. I'll be there in just a few minutes. And he eventually came. Here's the point I told all of this. Just because there was a delay doesn't mean the pizza wasn't coming. The pizza was on its way. There was just a delay. And it wasn't even cold when it got there. The miracle of whatever they put that in, it was still warm. Not tasty, but it was Domino's, and you can't make Domino's tasty. It came. Here's the point. The passage of time does not negate the promises of God. Third thing, God's fulfilled promises always exceed our expectations. You know what the Israelites were looking for? They were looking for a political ruler to come in and turn away the Assyrians and turn away the Babylonians and turn away the Medes and turn away the Persians and to turn away the Romans and to restore what they were looking for, what they had in the past. They wanted someone who could come in and restore this political power. But here's the thing. If the Messiah would have come in and restored this political power, what would they have benefited? They would have benefited for however long they lived, or however long he was in power, right? Either they're going to die and that benefit ends, or if the Messiah dies, which we know he did, and that power ends, either way, the power ends, right? That's what they're looking for here. They're looking for somebody to come in and to rule them and to reign over them. But God, in his infinite wisdom, knew that there was a much bigger problem than the political problem of Israel. There was a much bigger problem than the invaders of Israel even. The people were in bondage, but they were in bondage more so than somebody who was just enchained in actual chains. They were enchained in sin, and they were enchained and made slaves to this sin that had come into the world. God knew they had a much bigger issue than what they were realizing. God knew that what they wanted was actually just a fleeting thing. God knew that what they needed was permanent and it was eternal. Their expectation was that the Messiah would come in and he would restore this political power to Israel as a king. But God had this different plan. He said, I'm going to restore more than the nation of Israel. I'm going to come in and I'm going to redeem humanity as a whole. He wanted to restore not just the nation of Israel, but the Garden of Eden. He wanted man and God to walk together again in the coolness of the day, just like it was in Eden. The people had this expectation of what the Messiah should be and what the Messiah should do. And when Jesus came to the earth, he disappointed their expectations. Do you remember we looked at it last week? John the Baptist, the guy who was proclaiming the Messiah is going to come. He gets in prison and he sends his disciples out to Jesus and he said, hey, tell me, are you really the one we're looking for, or should we be looking for somebody else? And the word says that Jesus said, go and tell John what you hear and see. The blind receive their sight and the lame walk. Lepers are cleansed and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have good news preached to them. What was John saying? Are you really this person? Because I expected something completely different. And Jesus said, well, I'm sorry to disappoint your expectations, but I'm about to shatter any expectations that you thought you would have. Jesus wasn't even living up to the disciples' expectations. What were their last words? We think about the last words and we give ourselves grief over things we say to people and when something happens. Think about the disciples. What were their last words to Jesus? So is this when you're going to restore the nation of Israel? That's their last words to him. And the word says, Jesus said, that's not for you to worry about. You just go to Jerusalem and wait until you receive some power from on high. Then you're going to be the witnesses in Judea and Samaria and the uttermost parts of the earth. And he began to ascend right then. Right after he said that. You see what he was saying to them? He's saying, you have this expectation that I'm going to be this way, but I have a much bigger plan in store, and your expectation that you have of how I'm going to act can't even fathom what I'm about to do. I know you're disappointed that I'm not living up to that expectation. That's really what he's saying. But I'm not going to apologize for it, because sometimes I need to disappoint your expectations so that I can give you more than you could ever ask or imagine. And that's what he's saying here. He's saying, you may not get what you want. You may not get it when you want it, but you're going to get what you need, and you're going to get it in the right time, because my timing is always perfect, my provision is always sufficient, and it's going to come when it comes, when the timing is right. Things may not come in the way that we expect, but in hindsight, we're going to see that God has a better plan than we could ever dream of. I love this imagery. It's a little shoot inside of an old stump. I mean, you expect the shoot to just not get enough water or to die, somebody to cut it down with that weed whacker. That's what you expect. You don't expect it to amount to much, but God takes that expectation and he blesses it and multiplies it, like we saw in our last series, and he takes it farther than we could ever think in our head. God exceeds any expectation we would ever have of Messiah coming, and he says that little shoot, it's going to branch from its roots and it's going to bear fruit. That little baby, in other words, he's going to grow in wisdom, he's going to grow in stature, he's going to call some disciples, he's going to do some miracles, he's going to preach some sermons, but most of all, he's going to go to a cross and he's going to die for you. That's what he's saying there. He's not going to do what you expect him to do. He's not going to become king. In fact, he's going to turn away every time that they try to make him king. He's going to walk away from that. He's going to hide because he doesn't want to be king. But he's going to exceed your expectations because he's going to be the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. When he does that, it exceeds our expectations, and it exceeds anything they ever expected from God. He will rule and reign forever. It says, there shall come forth a shoot from the stump of Jesse, and a branch from his roots shall bear fruit. I love that imagery. Dead stump, life growing out of it. And as I was thinking about this passage this week, it began to make me think of other images. It began to make me think of some stump that existed 730 years later that was a full tree at one time, full of life, until some Roman soldier came up and chopped it down. And he began to split the wood that came from it. And he began to make logs out of that tree. And two of those logs became a crossbeam. And out of that stump, eternal life sprang forward. That's what I thought of when I thought of this week. The branches, he said, will bear fruit. And all believers are going to eat of that someday. Out of that death, out of that stump, grew a new branch. And I want to associate another passage with this, Revelation 22:1. Listen to this and picture it in your mind as we read it. Then the angel showed me the river of the water of life, bright as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb through the middle of the street of the city. Also on either side of the river, the tree of life with its 12 kinds of fruit, yielding its fruit each month. The leaves of the tree were for the healing of the nations. No longer will there be anything accursed, but the throne of God and of the Lamb will be in it, and his servants will worship him. They will see his face, and his name will be on their foreheads, and night will be no more. They will need no light of lamp or sun, for the Lord God will be their light, and they will reign forever and ever. That little shoot grew into a tree of life. And that's what we have to look forward to. My old church, I don't know if they still do it, but our pastor would say, here's what you do if you attend Silver Moon. He said, when we get to heaven, he said, we're going to all meet. And it's going to be right under the tree of life. And it's going to be, I forget if it was the left side or the right side. I better ask somebody if I want to be there, right? And with that group. But he said facing the throne will be, I think it was the left side of the tree of life. And that's where we're going to meet when we all get to heaven that day. We'll all meet right there. And I remember we made this video when we left, and it was just of our time at the church, and there was no way. He said, you can preach, you can speak, you can do whatever. Listen, there was no way I could get up and talk. I was so emotional leaving, and I mean, I was a wreck. So I made this video, we played it. I tried not to cry during the video, but the very end of the video, after we showed all these things, the way I closed it was, we'll see you under the tree of life on the left side of the river of life, facing the throne, and I hope you don't mind if we bring a few friends. And that's how we closed it. That's going to be us. Verse 16 of Revelation 22, Jesus said, I, Jesus, have sent my angel to testify to you about these things for the churches. I am the root and the descendant of David, the bright morning star. As we light this faith candle today, here's what I want you to remember. No matter what you're going through, no matter what your struggle no matter where you're at, God's promises bring life to decaying situations. The passage of time does not negate the promises of God, and God's fulfilled promises will always exceed your expectations. It's faith. Faith is not something that's built in a day. Rome wasn't built in a day, they say. I know our courthouse in Jasper County wasn't built in a day. It's been like 2 years. It takes a while to build these things. But faith comes in the midst of trials and in the midst of uncertainties, trusting and standing on the promises of God. That's where faith comes in. So we're going to light this candle. We've got the hope candle. Now we have the faith candle.